We're the book friends that think good.
What does this mean for our life, for our world? Yiggity yeet, my dude. I'm happy to speak. Always happy to think.
I don't know how to do that. I can look into that.
Makes you sound like a book friend that can think good.
It's Jack and it's Weston.
BFTTGs. Yeah.
Jack, I think good. Sometimes I good think, too.
Makes you sound pretty good.
We might want to make it more concise. We are going to attempt to grapple and answer 3 questions. Number 1, what did we learn? Number 2, what did we disagree with? And number 3, what are we going to do about it? I am ready to roll.
I'm in it. Weston, my book friend, tell me, what book is it that we're thinking good about today?
This week, we are finishing talking about the first law in Atomic Habits, chapters 6 and 7. So in chapter 6, it's titled, Motivation is Overrated. Environment Often Matters More. I have a lot to say about this. What about you, Jack?
Yes, my book friend. I have a lot of thoughts about this. Motivation is overrated. And then chapter 7, just so that we get the idea of kind of where we're going today, is the secret to self-control. Had a ton of thoughts about this. Loved it, first of all. Did a lot more work on my habits. And right up top, I just wanted to throw out a couple notes from Atomic Habits that we kind of left maybe hanging from past episodes. One is at the very outset of the podcast, we talked about Clares 1% improvements and the example of British cycling. And I did go back and read that article. Did you get a chance to look at that one too?
I have not.
Yeah, so basically what he acknowledges, and I think this just lends to his credibility as an author and, writer and just person in general, is he went back and looked at British cycling, and there's been allegations, of course, of, what do you think, my book friend?
Of doping, steroid use, cheating.
Yeah, exactly. Rampant cheating, basically. And he's like, that doesn't change the fact that it was the coaching philosophy. And the coaching philosophy, he kind of like makes the case of like, even with the doping, their achievements are incredible and like spread throughout the entire team. So it's hard to say like the individuals who've been accused like really spoil the whole bunch, but it's also impossible to ignore that fact. So, and the other thing is like, he does make the point that like British cycling, there was nothing conclusive as of the time of like the writing of Atomic Habits. So, I don't know. I just thought it was a nice, like, he didn't even need to put the footnote in there, but it was nice that he did. And the article makes a good comment about that. We'll throw it in the comments of this show, just if you're interested in following up on that and seeing sort of what Clare talks about there. But
the other thing about that too is that it's not like the British cycling team was the only one doping. It's pretty rampant throughout the entire sport. So everything there, kind of like, take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you had a cyborg on your team, but like everybody else does, like you're competing at the same level anyway. So
yeah.
Right. Like it just
But that leads into this chapter when we're talking about how environment plays such a big role. Because that environment and the cyclists of where, well, if everyone else is doping, we need to dope just to keep up with everyone else, right? Like it's they're a product of the environment, right?
Yep, exactly. That was actually kind of my first point. And really, it leads in better to chapter 7 with the example of Vietnam. But the hospital example he leads off chapter 6 with is a really interesting one too. The hospital and how they were trying to reduce soda sales for employees. And they just they refused to do any motivational speeches or advertising about health and wellness. They simply added water to the cafeteria. They just had water bottles. And they noticed that was decreasing soda sales. So they just added like a bunch more water stations. And the water just increased a ton. It reminds me of one of the things that as we kind of like started to flesh out this law and he starts talking about like habit stacking and stuff, he does make a point that that motivational speeches don't actually have any effect on people. And so, this environment piece was a really interesting example. Also, interestingly, I made a note at the very first, the second word of chapter 6 as we were reading. Did you catch that the lady who he cites here with this hospital study is Anne Thorndike?
Oh, he really likes the Thorndikes. With the
He
cats
does,
and
man.
this lady now?
Yeah,
I did not catch that.
this guy has a trend.
Oh,
Who likes
man.
that name, man?
That's funny. From that, I think it was the second page or so of chapter 6, the quote that stood out to me that I wrote down was, "Environment is the invisible hand that shapes human behavior."
Yep, that was my
And
first highlight.
when he shows the diagram of where they put all the water bottles, the locations in the hospital to boost those sales and decrease the sales of soda, I thought about, I mean, as, again, through an education lens, that is exactly what I've done with my classroom when it is not the times that it is now. And I said it's key for every educator to understand this concept because it's one of the biggest focuses on how I set up my room to give kids access constantly and in multiple places throughout the room of things that they need and things that will lead them to the good habits and things that will lead them to be successful with their schoolwork. And that on the flip side of that, it's been one of my biggest frustrations with remote teaching because I cannot control their environments at home. So it takes away a lot of the power that I have as an educator to put them in a good space. And it is, ever since we came back from remote teaching, there have been so many limits that have been placed on like I've had to have my kids sit in rows, like their desks in rows and columns, like we're back in like the 50s or something. And it's so frustrating because, we keep getting talked to about, well, why are the kids still like not catching up? Why are the kids? And it's like, well, you've completely changed their environment and you've prevented me from doing what I know is best practices and putting them into a good environment. Granted, it's been for the sake of health.
Yeah.
But it's been one of my biggest frustrations.
Yes.
And since this is a recurring theme on the podcast as well now, I have a music recommendation for everyone. It's a song called "Product of My Environment" by Sylvan LeCue. It is I'll put the link in the description. Do you know that song?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's like 3 songs in one. It's a journey, and it's amazing. It is explicit, so I'll warn you about that. It's not kid friendly, but it's a very powerful song. So that was kind of what I took away. The environment is the invisible hand, and that's one of the biggest tools that I have as an educator in changing the environment within my room to make my kids more successful.
Yeah, well, and that's an interesting point that you bring up, the example of education, how changing the environment is harmful, because that's really what he gets to in these 2 chapters. The environment can work for you or the environment can work against you. But either way, the environment is doing something to you. That's a really important piece. And, this is something that shouldn't really surprise anybody, just because it's something that human beings have been doing for a super long time. Like looking at religion, like this is the whole idea behind like the temple as a concept. Like this is the environment in which God lives, and that has taken various different shapes over time. And how that shape looks affects what people think. Like the Middle Ages, for instance, church construction with cathedrals, stained glass, vaulted ceilings, flying buttresses. Like the whole idea is like, look up. Like this is literally a giant arrow that points to heaven. And like it's also this space that is so expansive that makes you think of what's beyond you. And it gave people hope in a time when life was extremely bleak. That was the whole sort of concept. Now, what it actually does to people is very different sort of idea. Like one thing that currently is being challenged in the church is like facing forward, like a movie theater, right? So you sitting in pews was initially as like you are students being taught by a teacher. And that was positively associated with church, But these days, I mean, I think there's been such an abuse of that power or that authority in the church as a pattern, or there's been so much hypocrisy that's been wrought from that the idea of facing forward in pews like you're in school or something, you're subordinate to this other man, is kind of an interesting notion that I find a lot of churches are squashing or pushing against, where they say like, well, let's sit in the round, or let's turn towards each other, or let's, all stand at the same level, sort of this like equals idea. And like, you can see that like the environment is crafted to communicate a specific message. So in some sense, this was a huge learning for me. And in another way, it's just another example of where Clares putting language and concept behind something that we should understand, but we probably don't really understand enough.
Have you considered, and again, I know you have different levels within your church of like, you have, the big group meeting, you have other small group meetings. It would be interesting for me to discuss further with you, maybe applying some of my teaching techniques to a church setting in terms of like, I don't know if you've done this, but like having everyone sit in small groups of 3 or 4 and having them do an activity that illustrates a point, like whatever verse or passage that you're trying to get across that week, and then having that be their call to action and then going out into the community and like doing it. Have you ever done anything like that?
No, but that's a great idea. I mean, yeah, no, our experiment with forums is just in doing like the smaller groups, like you mentioned, like breaking into houses and meeting as more micro churches. But yeah, I mean, that kind of thing needs to happen, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's always what I thought church lacked, and I was always frustrated by that in church. So to give a little personal piece away, I'm very faithful, but I do not go to church, and I find it to be a waste of time. And I know that hurts your heart to know that, Jack, but I think that it needs to be about the action. And like, I find church needs to be more about putting people to action within the community. And that was always frustrating to me about churches. I would go and we would hear this lesson, and like you said, sitting in the front or sitting in facing front, and we'd hear this message, and then it'd just be like, all right, go back to your regular life and don't do anything about it. And I'd be like, well, aren't we going to like apply that now? Like, I want to go apply that. Go to a shelter, go to a park, and whatever we're going to do, like whatever the lesson was that week.
It's one of the biggest, it's one of the biggest criticisms. It's like your body is near me, but your heart is far from me, right? Like the prophets talk about that kind of attitude. And I think that's like, we run that risk of being those geese in the Kierkegaard swamp, right? That's why that's one of my favorite parables for church. It's like the goose preacher spreads his wings, and the geese who listen to him just are like, oh, that'd be nice. Like, it's such it is a problem, and it's something that people are taking notice of. And one of the things I really like about the millennial and the Gen Z like generation that's coming after us is like, rather than rest on our laurels, I think both of these generations are very much like observe and like take note and act. And it's just something that I think we'll see a strong reaction. This is part of the reason the pews are emptying, right? Like, people are not going to church because it's not seen as essential, because it's not essentially impacting their lives or their communities.
Right.
And you know what? If it's not, people shouldn't go. Right? Like, frankly, there should be a call to transformation there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or some sort of, like I'm in my Bible every morning. I read it. I do my devotional every day. So it's like, it's not like I don't have a relationship with God and I don't have a very strong connection with that part of my life. But I don't see the need for a church. Or, the other hard part is it's really hard to find a church if you're looking, if you move. But anyways, I know we could talk about that for a long time. I'll leave you with this, though. 2 notes to think about in your pastoralship.
Yeah, pastoral. Yeah.
At least in education, the common knowledge that research has shown to be the best small group size is 3 to 4 people, like 4 people max, but really 3 people is best. So if you want to try to apply that at any point, 3 people is best.
Yeah.
And then as much hands-on as possible. So like I was already thinking of like things you could do with Play-Doh. Every time it talks about like building yourself up or the man, or you could have Play-Doh and have your group do things and shape things. And then, but anyways, I know we could have ideas for that for a long time.
No, absolutely. And you brought up something that I think is really just an important piece of advice. And this is maybe something that this is something I say to people when they move and they're like, how do I find a church? One of the things I always say, and it actually dovetails really nicely to what Claire is talking about in this chapter, which is like, mind the environment. Like, you can't just go once to know what church is like, because you'll hear a speech by a guy, and who knows, that might be the lead pastor, that might be some guest who just like you happened in on that Sunday. It might be that they're doing a fundraising campaign and that's what you hear and you're like, boring, or like, ugh, like, do they do this every week? You never really know. But even more importantly is the people that surround you, because that's what the church is. Like, you need to get a sense for that environment to really know what a church is. Not like the speaker, not the sound, not the stage, not the building. Like, those are all environmental things to take note of, but the environment around you that will impact you the most are the people around you, which is really, that was my big learning from these 2 chapters that we read, was the people around you, the environment around you. And I think just because I already talked about it a little bit, I will share that story from Vietnam, where he talks about heroin use in chapter 7. And he says, soldiers, when they came back from Vietnam, were addicted to heroin. I mean, it was like 20% of soldiers, I think, is the numbers he says. And then 90%, 9 in 10 of those soldiers stopped using heroin when they came home from Vietnam. But the almost exact inverse is true here. People addicted to heroin who go to rehab, 90% relapse when they return home. Why? Because of their environment. And their environment is not just the physical walls that surround them. It's their neighborhood. It's the people they interact with. It's their friends. In Vietnam, you were with a platoon of soldiers all doing heroin together. You come home, you're completely removed from all of those people and all of the cues that made you want to do that thing. So, I mean, really I
think all the cues were a major part of that. The stress, being far away from home, not with, family members that would support you. Yeah. Being around other people that are feeling just as stressed. I mean, I can't imagine. I cannot imagine being in that situation. I would probably be one that would succumb to that and become a heroin addict. For sure. Yeah. Well, and I mean, that was, if we're talking about learnings or nuggets from this section of this book, like, that was the biggest one. That was the biggest takeaway for me, was the conventional association of unhealthy behaviors that it is moral weakness, page 92. But I think we are getting a little ahead of ourselves. I have a lot of notes between those 2 pages. Do you want to backtrack a little bit? Yeah, for sure. But I just wanted to address that and just like kind of bring it up so we can talk about it later. Yeah, for sure. After the first 3 pages, my next one was on page 84. Did you have anything between 82 and 84? No, not really, because he's just talking about how the environment can work for us. Well, here's something that I didn't realize before. One of my learnings was I didn't realize that our experiences were so vision dependent. So he brings up this quote on page 84. The human body has about 11 million sensory receptors, and approximately 10 million of those are dedicated to sight. 10 out of 11 are sight. So, like, I knew that we relied on vision, but for whatever in my head, I always thought it was like we had even amount of receptors for the 5 senses. And I'd never considered that we had a lot more that help us see rather than hear and taste and smell. And, I like that he brings out to, thus, a small change in what you see can lead to a big shift in what you do in your environment. And I really liked the phrase a few pages after that, connecting to that on page 87, where he says, be the designer of your world, not merely the consumer of it. Because I do think that a lot of us tend to get into a situation like we were just talking about, you move, and then you just kind of assimilate and accept what's there.
Yes.
Right? And like you were saying, the newer generation's coming up, and I think that's a great thing. Like, we need to be able and be willing to change the environment around us. So
yes.
I think that's been one of the biggest shifts and one of the best shifts of the newer generations, younger generations coming up, is that they're not okay with the status quo. Whereas, and I also want to give older generations credit. Okay.
Yeah, right.
I really push against the idea of like, oh, the new generation sucks or the new generation is bad. And that's something that has been prevalent probably throughout most of human history. Like, oh, these young kids don't know what the hell they're doing, right?
Sure, yeah.
But when you look back at, because like right now the big thing is boomers versus millennials and Gen Zers, right? And I think boomers need to like take a step back. I hear a lot of that from boomers anyway, like our parents' age. And I have a lot of coworkers that are in that age.
Yeah.
Although less so now. But anyways, I think they need to take a step back too and realize that they were the children of the 60s. Like, they rebelled too. They changed the status quo just as much.
Yeah, right.
So understand that that's just the thing that the younger generations typically do, and it's usually for the good. It's a good thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just listening to a episode of This Cultural Moment where they were talking about freedom. Basically, there are three buckets of life was the concept that they talk about, which is like freedom, community, significance. And what happened kind of with our parents' generation is freedom like skyrocketed. Like, and in the 80s and 90s, like, our parents provided incredible lives for a lot of us who have, grown up in the millennial or Gen Z generations. Like, their freedom, like, motivated them in really interesting career moves, really, like, interesting financial investing opportunities, really interesting, movements. Like, Amazon is a good example. Like, people shifted away to like, oh, I don't need to go down to the store in town. I'm just going to buy everything from my couch. And we like emphasized freedom to such a point that we now we've lost a little bit of our community and a little bit of our significance. And really the like millennial generation has pushed very, very strongly into community as we start to emerge as consumers. It's something that we see being willing to do something like pay extra for a haircut to go to like a legit barber in your city is a good example. Or like the classic examples are like avocado toast, craft beer, lattes. But like the thing is, all of those are important signposts that say like, we don't mind paying for something quality if it's something we can get in our neighborhood.
Right. Actually, like, that's a perfect example right here is, so for all of our watchers on YouTube, I know that my background right now is very barren. So I went to a local woman that does custom framing and stuff, and I wanted to go to her instead of like a Michaels or something like that to get some artwork and some decorations framed. And I mean, I was initially shocked by how much it was going to cost, but I was like, it's worth it. It's a local artist, local craftsperson doing their thing, and I think that's worth it. She's like just 10 minutes away from me, works out of her house. Like, I think that's just like what you were saying. It's important to support the local community.
Totally. And one of the things that we don't give our parents credit for is like they sacrificed. So there's freedom, community, significance. They sacrificed some of their significance to increase their freedom. Mm-hmm. They were willing to do things like, I'll gut it out at this job, or I'll stick it out in this bad situation so that I can have more freedom. And that's something that like they are marked by. And now, like, that's one of the things that they consider like bad about us maybe is like, oh, like, why would you just quit a job after a year? Like, you have to like stick it out for 5 or 6 years. And it's like, it's a terrible company. I don't want to work there.
I think, well, like, and to connect that back to our chapter, I think that our generation is more keenly aware of our environments.
Yes.
And we're more keenly aware of what exactly our environments are doing and how they're shaping our beliefs about ourselves and the environments that we're in.
Yes,
so I think
exactly.
That's been something too that the younger generations have picked up on more, is like, no, if this environment sucks, I don't like. I'm willing to change it, and sometimes that means I'm going to leave this environment. Like if I don't have the power to actually change this environment, like if there's these bigger ups at this company that are not willing to budge or not willing to change anything, I am willing to move so that it changes my environment for me. And
yeah, like one of my and that maybe is an area of pushback in this chapter for me, which is also on page 84, which is the way he ends it is, thankfully there's good news in this respect. You don't have to be the victim of your environment. You can also be the architect of it. And I actually agree with that. But I do have this pushback in that architect is like a high level position. Like sometimes you're just a contractor who can remodel their position, their environment, right? Like you can step in and maybe like ease some of the cracks without entirely changing it, because there are some things that I think that attitude can be really harmful for, which is something like a good example would be something like marriage, which is like you can, maybe start to realize like, there are maybe some bad things going on here, but I would advise working on those things and like changing them slowly rather than being like, let's completely redesign this thing, which I think is an attitude that a lot of people have. Just like, I'm just going to bail and go do something else.
Are you talking about like divorce rates?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's that's kind of maybe a negative consequence of of this. But I agree with you, obviously, because my wife and I have matching tattoos, and our big motto is keep building. And I think that there's something to having a stick-to-itiveness. To dealing with those environments and building them yourself and being the architecture, no matter how long that takes or how hard it is. Because I will say that like it is very difficult to be that architect, but man, it is rewarding when you when you completely change your environment and make it the way that is ideal for you. All the hard work becomes worth it, at least in my experience. But I will say this, it is tough and it takes a long time. Because not only do you have to have a vision of what you want to do, but you do have to work within the confines of the structures around you and what is possible, right? We don't all have endless resources and endless time to be changing these things around us. Yeah.
You do also have to have a meter. Like on page 85, he talks about electric meters. Like the more visible your electric meter is, the lower your electric bill. I think that's one of the things that makes us very different from the generation that precedes us, and especially the generation that preceded them, the silent era generation. Is like our mental health, like the destigmatizing of mental health that's happened in our lifetime is so, so crucial. Like we have a way better handle on that. But part of it is because we see it. And like that was just so hidden for like my grandparents, like there was no discussion of that. That was not
so many things were taboo, and like the closeted alcoholism, right? At least that I've seen a lot in my extended family and older family. It's just like there's a lot of people fooling themselves, thinking just because the topics were taboo, thinking that I don't know, just going too hard with that stuff, to try and deal with it. Where it's like, I don't know. I just recently kind of abstained from alcohol within the last 2 months. And it's not like I was drinking a lot before that, but it was just like, dude, we've talked about this. We're getting to the age where even if I have like one, I end up with like a little mini hangover the next day. And I'm like, damn, I'm old. Like, I just don't want to do that anymore. It's not worth it for like the hour of kind of tipsiness or whatever the night before. And it's like, I've seen so many like just in that generation, that older generation, where it's like that was just how they dealt with it. Instead of dealing with the root cause, there's a lot of symptom. What's the word I'm looking for? A lot of symptom.
Symptomatic.
Well, they're just dealing with the symptoms rather than the root cause.
Yeah.
And they would cover it up with the medicine of alcohol or drugs in the 60s and 70s and stuff. And it's like
Clare talks about that in chapter 7.
Right. Yeah. So I might be getting ahead of myself there too.
Yeah.
I had a big pushback on page 89. Did you have anything else before page 89 that you want
No, let's go there. Let's do that.
Okay, so I had like a very visceral reaction to this quote where on page 89 he argues for one space, one use.
Yeah.
Okay, do you have that too? So
well, we'll see. But
okay, I said while I agree that's ideal, it's not realistic at all. This phrase came off very elitist and condescending to me, and honestly, my initial reaction was, "Fuck you, dude." Especially given the context of the last 2 years in the pandemic, and I know this book was written before that, so it's not like he knew about that. But especially given the context of the pandemic, when people were forced to cramp together, it's no wonder that like domestic violence and divorce rates skyrocketed in the last 2 years. He addresses this to end the chapter, but pretty weakly, in my opinion. Like I did not like how he addressed it. He says to divide your room into activity zones. And I just did not think that was satisfactory. But I do think that his point of trying to change your environment still stands. I've just found I've found a lot of success with that strategy in my own life, but I consider myself very lucky to have gotten to the point that I've gotten to where I do have multiple spaces that I can use that.
Yes.
I wasn't able to get to my point until I was in my late 20s. So what the hell are young adults supposed to do amid this quagmire of a housing market, especially, and the increasing wealth divide? Like, they need to have multiple uses for one space. He ends this chapter by stating that a stable environment is where habits can easily form. And I hope he dives into that more in the upcoming chapters, because I totally agree with that. Stable environment is more important than having one space, one use.
Yes. It's interesting that you call it elitist, because you and I both know people who are like, families of 5, 6 live in a 1-bedroom apartment. Like, we both know that reality is so true for so many Americans, let alone people in the rest of the world. Like Americans have more space. That's just a fact. Like there is more space for living than other places in the world. So like that is a very sort of in some way it strikes as myopic. On the other side, he does like acknowledge it a little bit with the activity zones, and like my apartment is the size of a smartphone, right? I live in New York City. Like those kind of ideas, like having your reading chair. I will say like it's been something that I've been experimenting with in my own life a little bit. Like I have this chaise lounge back there, and like the chaise lounge is exclusively for reading and praying. Like that's what I use that chair for. And I don't sit on it any other time. But like I go to that chair and I do those activities, and like that's what that chair is for. And that's been like a really cool sort of like check down, is like, okay, I'm in this spot, I'm doing this thing. One of the things when I first started working from home, because I started working from home before the pandemic set in, I worked for a company that was completely remote. And I struggled a lot with, even in my large space, I have a full house with multiple rooms. Even in my large space, I struggled with the same shutdown idea that Clare talks about as an entrepreneur, of like doing his work and leisure on the couch in the same space. And I think that this could apply for people who live in cramped spaces as well, or with multiple family members, or who have lives that are not conducive to doing things like setting up activity zones. One of the things I did was environment shifting, was changing environment. So like after work, I would take my dog on a walk around the park and then come back. And I was like, what I realized is I craved the commute, because the commute was where I did my unpacking, my unwinding, my de-stressing. It was where I like shifted into home mode. It wasn't enough just to like walk into the next room. I needed that buffer of time and space and like personal space. And I think that that's something that like, if you have a family that lives together in like a small space or something, like having that respect for yourself and for others to give them space is really nice. And my wife did that for me. It was a huge gift to say like, okay, you're doing your commute now. right? So like I was done with work. I worked a pretty stressful sales job. I would grab the leash, I would walk, and then I would come back like a completely different person. Like, okay, stress is gone. I'm now actually home. I think that could be maybe another alternative to this is like task switching in a way that is environment shifting.
I think that's a great point and a great idea. That's something that I dealt with remote teaching that I never got a grapple on. I was just I was so happy to go back to the classroom.
Yeah.
Because just sitting up here trying to teach from this computer all day and like not even being able to move. Like it's like, in a normal classroom setting, we can move around the room a little bit. We are going to lunch, we're going to recess, we're going to music, we're going to PE, things like that, where it's like, there's natural environment shifts. And I never considered that. And I think my lack of consideration for that made remote teaching very difficult for me.
Yeah. One of my things that I pushed back on this section with, because I agree, but I had a totally different sort of pushback. And like when I'm reading his writing, I don't know what his family structure is like, if he's married or has kids or whatever. But I envision a 35-year-old man who lives in a like townhouse like in New York by himself.
Yeah,
like
I could see
that's the lifestyle I'm envisioning that he kind of describes. And I'm like, dude, like I have a wife and kid, like,
and a dog.
Like this is one of the things I've been wondering about this whole thing is like my habits are not my own.
Yes.
Like, and my cues are not entirely under my control, right? Like,
right.
I get stress cues from my daughter all the time, and I can never shut them down. Like, she cries, I respond, but like the crying always stresses me out, and like it's biologically hardwired for that to happen. When your own kid cries, you care.
Yeah.
Like, and that's a good thing, but it's also a very difficult thing, and it disrupts my habits, and it creates these weird feedback cues that I have no idea what to do with, to be quite honest. Like, when I've been writing down, I put my daughter's name on that habit, like, habit inventory that he put, and it was just all question marks. Because I'm like, I don't know, is this habitual? Is this like conscious? Is this non-conscious? It seems like both,
That's one of the toughest things about having young kids is like they're so unpredictable that how are you supposed to stack a habit cue with them when you never know? You never know exactly when something might happen or something new is going to happen because they're always changing, they're growing, they're developing. But I think that's one thing that I hope gets addressed deeper in the book is that like how do you maintain flexibility while trying to go through these processes in the habit loop, and like we talked about last week, it's just like, I mean, what do you do when a wrench gets thrown in your plans?
I mean, like a good example is the whole insomniac study he talks about on page 88, where they tell insomniacs just go to bed, only get in your bed when you're tired. I have read that many, many times because I struggle with falling asleep. I don't struggle with sleeping. I'm not necessarily an insomniac, but I struggle with falling asleep. And part of that is because I do unwinding activities that are unhealthy and non-conducive to sleep, like watching TV or scrolling on my phone. And I know that, but I also don't want to change that. So I've been like...
if you know what's good, it's easy to do it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like, I know those things aren't helpful. I should read or whatever. But like, here's the bigger issue. My wife goes to bed earlier than me, like just all the time. And she wants me in bed with her.
Same, Steve.
Yeah. And that's the thing where it's like, that's a bid for intimacy, right? Like, she's just saying, hey, I want to be near you. And I'm like, I pushed against it for a very long time. But just recently, like within the last couple months, I shifted my mindset where I'm like, oh, you dumb me. She cares about it. Like, the reason that she wants that is because she loves you and she wants that nearness with you. So I've just been like going to bed with her when she goes to bed, like getting in bed with her rather than just like kissing her and like putting her to bed. Like, I actually get in bed. But like, I can't control, like, I have to make that sacrifice with this habit to where I can't do one space, one use with my bed, really.
Right.
So, like, I'm going to struggle against that, and I just have to, like, cope with it a little bit. So I think that sometimes, like, this is where I just thought, like, we have to be, I talked about this in an earlier episode, but, like, the whole identity around your habits thing is maybe something that we need to be very careful of. It's like, if you become a habit Spartan, you might ruin your marriage. Right.
Yeah. I have two things in response to what you just said. One, I am the flip of you. I just recently started not doing that. Because I was doing that for a while to try and get, build that intimacy and get closer with my wife. But I have realized that I am not the best husband I can be if I do that. Because I need that commute time. And for me, that is, I need an hour or two by myself at night to clear my head. And it helps me with falling asleep as well, because then the room becomes, when I go in there,
a sleep
I
zone.
go to sleep. Yeah. And so I've successfully made that switch over the last few months, and it's made, and this kind of goes back to what we said last week about it's individual to everyone, but it's made my marriage better because I become a better husband because because if I'm in there when I know I don't want to be in there, but I'm just like, I'm just doing this for you. I'm just doing this for you. Like, it stresses me out because then I'm like, well, I'm not going to have time to do any of the things I need to do or I want to do. And then it just builds up that stress, builds up that cortisol or whatever. And like, I get frustrated and I have a shorter temper. So I need that space, that commute space, like you were talking about. I usually have that at night and in the mornings.
This is one of the things that I think people don't understand about love or compromise is like, sometimes compromise is like, I'm going to sacrifice for you. Like, and in our cases, like it's an inverse. I'm like, this is it's inconvenient for me, but I'm the one making the sacrifice for this because the benefit for my wife is so much greater. But the flip is true for you. Like, for you, it's your wife who's like, I'm willing to, give that space and like recognize that this is important to you and like let you do this thing that's so valuable for your mental health and your physical health that like it makes you better in other ways. And like that, I think is just a perfect example of how like we need to give ground in different and specific ways. Okay, so the last really big one for me in this particular chapter was the phone mishmash. It talks about how like our phone is a mishmash of cues, and like the one space, one use thing for technology is very interesting to me. I'm not sure how to implement it because like I don't have a million tech devices, so I'm not like,
I agree. I can't.
I'm not swapping between like laptop, tablet, my watch, my phone. Like I have my phone, my computer. That's really where I do both work and communication. But I do like the idea that he brings up of like, can you find one space, one use in technology? Can you like separate those things out? Because that is, as a self-directed employee, like as a person who works in a self-directed manner, that's my biggest problem is switching between like fun communication and serious communication, which is just happens all the time.
Interesting.
Like, we're on multiple group texts with different friend groups, and like you and I are in the same groups.
Yeah.
So we see all of those. I get those alongside group texts for church. There's sometimes like serious things, like I'm planning a memorial service this weekend. And like, it's like, boom, my friend's workout text, boom, this memorial service, boom, 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 boom. And it's kind of jarring, but like one is work, one is pleasure. They're on the same device. What do I do?
Yeah, I pushed back at this too, where, again, I guess going back to my elitist comment, like, dude, everyone can afford all these devices for all the different things that they need to do.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think we've kind of spoken enough on that.
Sure. Yeah. But anyway, just an interesting thing to consider, and I wanted to bring it up because it's so prevalent in our society.
It is. And it's something that we all need to deal with and figure out. I said my big call to action for this chapter, as we wrap up chapter 6, was I want to revisit my spaces and reflect on my current visual cues and ones that I could potentially add or change. And I said the same thing as you. I'll admit it's hard when you have a family. I can't just change everything without talking to my wife about it. We kind of said that this is something else that needs to be addressed. And I said the same thing. This all sounds fine and dandy when you're single, but how do you change these things when disagreements arise?
Yes. I just recently started doing this in various different ways, and I found it actually very helpful to bring environment into the conversation with my wife, to say okay, what's the space that I can do this thing or should do this thing? Because one of the things we've been talking about and having a little bit of an issue lately, really it's my issue, is schedule. It's okay, so when are you here with us, family, and when are you work here? You're here but you're working. And we just after reading this chapter, I was environment. I have an office I can go to part-time. Maybe I just go there more. So I've started setting more times to go to the office. This week worked great. Also, I have an office in my house, which is this, and just being more dedicated and specific about place. Like I said, I have this chair, I have this, and just being more disciplined about that. This is workspace. That's reading space. Upstairs is family space. That's been a very helpful shift for me. And it's just something I'm going to continue doing, is cataloging my environment. Okay, what happens in these places? Because I think the awareness is the first step. And Claire talks about that at the very outset of the book.
And I think that's a great thing to do, catalog it. And it seems to connect very well with Chapter 7 here, because you mentioned that you've been more disciplined with it. But Chapter 7 talks about, what is the secret to self-control? How do we discipline ourselves?
Yes.
So, what did you think about in Chapter 7?
Man, Chapter 7 was so eye-opening for me. And just so, it was so refreshing to me to hear. This was my big takeaway, and I may be jumping notes a little bit, but forgive me for that. The thing that he says this on page 92 leading into 93. It's kind of an extended quote, so I'll just read the whole thing. When scientists analyze people who appear to have tremendous self-control, it turns out those individuals aren't all that different from those who are struggling. Instead, disciplined people are better at structuring their lives in a way that does not require heroic willpower and self-control. In other words, they spend less time in tempting situations. The people with the best self-control are typically the ones who need to use it the least. I love this. It's so refreshing to hear somebody say it so plainly, and to actually have some science that backs it up with the heroin case that we talked about earlier. But man, people sometimes act I've got it all figured out, or I've not got it figured out. And the reality is, as humans, we all struggle with things pretty similarly. And I can say that as a pastor, because I've dealt with people who look like they have it all together and people who look like they're falling apart, and they're succumbing to the exact same temptations in their lives. It's just a matter of what are you doing? Where are you going? Who are you around? And that really makes a huge, that's it. That's what it is. It's what is the environment that you are surrounding yourself with? Because that will dictate what you do.
I completely agree. And that's what I wrote too. I agree wholeheartedly about self-discipline just being about setting your environment up correctly, or in a way that's going to be conducive to you succeeding. My common one is, when I don't buy junk food, I don't eat junk food. So if I can manage to not buy it at the grocery store, I will not eat trash, right? We talked last time about being raccoons at night, and that's one of my struggles. Well, it's when I'm successful, when I go to the store and I don't buy anything, I don't have anything to eat. When I buy the healthy food and I have, like, that's why meal prep has been so big for me, and just in terms from a physical health standpoint, and which leads into mental health. But it's like, if I have my meals ready to go and I know it's going to be there, that's what I choose to eat. If I don't have anything else that I can eat, then I'm not going to eat garbage food. I'm going to eat the healthy food, or at least the food I perceive to be healthy at the time, right?
Yeah.
And again, this goes back to our other point, and I don't know if you have this struggle, but I have this struggle where it's like, okay, I'm really good at that now. I'm really good about buying and not buying stuff.
Yeah.
But my wife is not. Like, my wife will still continue to buy treats for her because she does not have the same habits that I have growing up. Like, and I don't know, you could probably speak to this, but I thought a lot about in this part about how I come from a family of 4 kids. I have 3 siblings, and there was definitely times growing up where if I didn't get to the blueberries or the ice cream first, I didn't get any, right? So like, I created this horrible habit of as soon as it's there, I need to get it and I need to eat it all now because I don't think I'm going to have another chance to do it. Whereas my wife was an only child, and I don't think she had that pressure. Like, that pressure wasn't applied. Where like she could just have one cookie and then she'd know that they'd be there later.
They'd still be there later. Yeah.
And I don't know, it just created this very toxic mentality that I had to learn to break away from. But now, again, like we said, knowing the good doesn't mean that it's easy, because my wife will still buy those things, and she'll like it, dude. There are times where it will just destroy me. She'll like buy like cookies or Girl Scout cookies or whatever, and they'll sit in the cabinet for months.
Yeah.
And I've gotten good at like what I've actually had to do, and this is maybe gives credence to James Clear's ideas here, and I do think they do have validity. What I've been able to do that has been successful is this shelf in the pantry are Weston snacks. This shelf in the pantry are Alley snacks, and I'm much better at, okay, if they're on that shelf, I cannot touch them.
Yeah.
But if they're on this shelf, I'm gonna go to town. So like a lot of times I try and keep my shelf empty.
Yeah.
But then there's times too where she'll be like, all right, I'm done with this. You can have it. And then of course I just become a wood chipper. And,
Yeah. Like Oreos, like we both love Oreos, and you and your family down in racks. Yeah. Like the whole sleeve of Oreos.
Yeah. Dude. So bad, dude.
But that is like it reminds me of when we read Sapiens, and they talk about like hunter-gatherer mentality. It was like, you see a full fig tree as like a, ancient caveman. What do? You eat all of the figs. Like, and that's why we have the obesity crisis we do now, because like our genetics are the same, right? We're still like, I have this whole Big Mac. I'm not going to save it. I'm just going to house it. Right. But yeah, I mean, we're maybe the same, but kind of different. Like where I'm the problem in our house in that way. Like I am an impulse buyer. I'm like, I will, put the things out on the shelves. And like the good thing that my wife does for me is hide it. Like, oh yeah, I bought this, and I'll like stumble upon ice cream sandwiches like 4 days after grocery shopping. I'm like, oh, you got ice cream sandwiches and you didn't tell me. But like, it's like, thank you for doing that. Yeah. Like, there's a mutual agreement that that needs to be a secret. But that's it. That's so funny. That reminds me of like when we lived together as 19-year-olds and first encountered this issue where like you had bought Oreos. I ate them. Like I ate like most of them, and you're like, dude, you ate my food. And I was like, yeah, like that's what you do when you live with somebody.
Yeah, like, this is our first time ever living anywhere with each other, or like with anyone else.
With anybody
this is our
else.
Freshman year in college, and Jack was very much from the get-go like, oh, we're married. Like, what's yours is mine. What's mine is yours. And like, I did not have that mentality at all.
Yeah, you're like, get out of my food. And I was like, oh, that's a valid point.
Yeah.
Makes sense. I didn't realize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We learned, but we definitely had some discussions about it.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, well, and this is the big takeaway from this chapter is like, he makes a point about interruptions too, where he's like, it's hard to maintain a Zen attitude, page 94, in a life filled with interruptions. It takes too much energy. In the short run, you can choose to overpower temptation, but in the long run, we become a product of the environment we live in. Yeah. I could not agree more with that statement. Yeah. I have seen it so many times in others, in my own life, that I just cannot do anything but assume that that is a universal truth. The evidence is just way too powerful that is a true statement.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know what I've recently been doing with my son too to kind of test this theory? I've been seeing when he will get the concept of delayed gratification. Like at dinner time, I will put like one, I don't know, fruit snack or some little thing that he really likes to eat, right? Yeah. And I'll say, buddy, if you eat the rest of your dinner first and then eat this one, I'll give you 2 fruit snacks. He has not succeeded yet. It's always, he's like, oh, okay. And I'm like, so just so you know, like you have 1 right now. But if you save this one, I'll give you another one later and you're going to have 2 of them instead of just 1. And he goes, oh, I can have 2? And I'm like, yeah. Still the first thing he eats. Yeah. Like there's one time literally I gave him, we had like a little bag of mini Oreos, right? And I gave him 1 and I said, you can have 2, right? And he literally grabbed it and he was like, oh, I can have 2 if I don't eat this one later? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, okay. All right, dude. Yeah, he still doesn't get that yet.
I think that might be jumping to James Clear's second law, or one of the laws, which is like decreasing enjoyment or like increasing the enjoyment of things. Mm-hmm. But that's a really good point of like delayed, like, man, we were just so bad at that stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, when you think about it in nature too, like think about the squirrels, how they hoard nuts. Think about all the animals that they come up to a fig tree like that, they're going to eat it. I mean, dude, just last year, I started my first foray into gardening. Jack, I think I've told you this story, but it's funny that relates to this. Yeah. And I grew corn. And my corn stalks were looking fantastic. Like, they say knee-high by the 4th of July is like the phrase that corn growers have, I guess. Yeah. And mine were like shoulder height by July 4th. Yeah. Mine were just absolutely doing awesome. I was feeling really proud of myself. I was like, dang, I actually am like growing some stuff. Yeah. And the day before I planned on harvesting them, a single squirrel, went through all of my corn stalks early one morning before I could even wake up and ate 20 cobs of corn. 20! Yeah. And then had the audacity, this little squirrel, to lay down and sleep because he was so full with a cob of corn that had been bitten off and eaten, laying next to him, right by my back patio, where I could see, like, he was 4 feet away from me. And my cats were, like, freaking out. My cats were like, oh, my God, let me at him, Dad. Let me at him. And I was like, I want you to, but I'm not. I'm just going to let this little guy enjoy his life. Like, oh, my God. I cannot believe that happened. So, yeah, it's like it's not like it's not natural for things to do that. If there's a resource available, you better get it now. Because, I mean, shit, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, right? So
this is one of the things that I have done recently in pastoral counseling. And this is where pastoral counseling is so different from mental health counseling. Because like I don't always give scientifically prudent advice. I just give life advice, right? And like you need someone sometimes to tell you the truth. And that's like where I feel like what I do is so different from what other professionals do. Like my sister-in-law is a social worker, and like we talk about things and I'm like, yeah, I would just say that this way, and she's like, I can't, and she like sometimes is a little bit like jealous of that, like it'd be nice to be able to like just say what I actually think rather than like run through the diagnostic code and manual and stuff. But there's credence to her approach too. Like it's very important that she's like checking all the boxes, doing due diligence. But like one of the things I have said is like I have dogs. Dogs are scavengers. They are slaves to their instincts. and their genetics. Like, man, all the training in the world will never, ever stop my dog from getting into the trash. Just can't be done. Like, she needs to be removed from the trash. That's the only way to not get her in the trash. And like, I can yell at her. I can like, swat her if she gets up on the trash or whatever. And like, it doesn't feel good. It's not helpful. It's never going to change. Like, if she has an open trash can and she thinks I won't notice, she will get in it. And like, there's no fixing or changing that. It's just genetic. Dog loves trash. And I think like, one of the things I've been saying to people, I talk with lots of men who have like, they deal with things that are serious, like anger issues or, like instinctual problems. And one of my calls to action is always, look, animals live by instinct, but we are human beings. Like, we have the ability to overpower those things. And not just by willpower, we have lots of tools to employ to overcome our biology. It's a very strong belief of mine. Like, as a spiritual being, you are so much more than a biological creature who is enslaved to the genetic hardwiring of your body. I think that like unlocking that truth is something that allows you to transcend and like really search for solutions where you say like, okay, I'm addicted to cigarettes. Stop. And like, not just that, but like figure out a way. There's a plan. There is a solution to this problem. There are things you can do. And like, as Claire talks about, there's a whole system of habit breaking. And one of those is make it invisible. Like, don't buy cigarettes. Don't buy chew. You'll be miserable, but you can you can withstand that. And I think that that's just one of those like small things that like this chapter makes me think is like, if you're motivated and like you just need a sliver of motivation to make a change that can shift something. I think that's a concept that he didn't connect as clearly as I would like. And that's maybe my one pushback for this chapter is like, he talks about habit stacking and making habits easy and obvious. And then he talks about environmental change. And I think the two need to be wed very, very closely, where it's like, change your environment in almost imperceptible ways.
Yes.
I'll give an example of building a good habit that I employed in the last week that's environmental. I've been wanting to drink a glass of water when I wake up and a glass of water when I go to sleep. That's just a habit that I've been like trying to instill for a little while because I read about the health benefits of it. And I also just notice I feel better when I do it. So one of the things I started doing is putting a glass of water out by the fridge, like water dispenser every morning. Or every evening when I go to bed, that's empty. And I see it in the morning. I grab it. I fill it with water. I drink it. And I put a glass of water near my bed. And it reminds me to like, oh yeah, fill this up. No, sorry, I've got those backwards. I take the one from the kitchen that's empty and I fill it up when I go to bed. And then the one from the one in the morning, I wake up and turn off my phone alarm. There are 2 glasses of water there because there's one from last night, right, that I brought in from the kitchen. So I like take that empty, I take one of them because I'm like, you can't have 2 glasses of water here. I take one and then take it to the fridge, fill it up and drink it. And it's just like a small like environmental change that I've been doing in the last week that's been really, really helpful. But it's so small. It's like a very, very small cue.
I think that's fantastic. I do something very similar with my water bottle as well that I have, maybe to end this episode, I have a funny example of a negative habit and how I was able to change the environment and impact a negative habit that my son had. Okay. So this is, I hope this works for other parents out there, but we, of course, were trying to be safe and we baby-proofed a lot of things in our house and they had, all these little baby-proof things. My son is a wizard and he gamified these. He turned all these little baby-proofing things into, oh, these are fun puzzles that Dad made for me. And so he would spend so much time trying to figure them out and successfully figuring them out, which would put him into dangerous situations because we put them on the spots where we didn't want him to go. So what my wife and I decided to do, stairs, the chemicals and stuff, like cleaning solutions, things like that, right? Or like pots and pans that were heavy for him and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So what we decided to do was just take everything away. That little change in his visual cues, because the other thing too, when you got to think about a toddler, is all those baby things are like right at eye level. Like we talked about the environment, right? They're right at eye level when he's walking around the kitchen or walking around the house. So they're like things that are popping out to him. So we took those away, and we have not had any issues. Like it took, a week of him being like, where's this? Where's that? But because he didn't care about what was inside. He cared about doing
the puzzle.
Yeah, he cared about the puzzle, right? So as soon as we took those away, it took, a few days, obviously, as it takes to develop habits. But we haven't had any issues with him being unsafe or anything like that because we've shifted the environment and put more enticing objects, in his playroom, and we've shifted the focus to don't go in here to like, hey, look at all this fun stuff over here, and like there's not even anything over there to distract you. So baby proofing, I'm a big advocate against it. Because I had a horrible experience with it, and I hope that maybe some of you parents out there can learn from that too. Because that was something that was definitely not intuitive to me in my life.
Yeah, we've been talking about baby proofing because we're just getting to that stage. Like my daughter will watch, and it's amazing how social human beings are. Like how much we learn by watching. Like she's getting to the stage where she watches me do something, and then she like does it a few seconds later, and it's like, whoa, man, I need to watch everything I do now.
Yep.
I am the cue.
Yeah,
and I think that there's that, like, that actually feeds into one of the other things he talked about that I thought was such a valuable lesson from this chapter. It's just that negative feedback loop, which is like, well, why do I eat junk food? To feel better. What makes me feel bad? Eating junk food. So I eat junk food to feel better because I feel bad about eating junk food, blah, 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 blah. And that's kind of how it is with kids. Like, kid is like, I want my parents' attention. I do a bad thing, they give me attention. I'll do a bad thing, I get attention. We talked about that with kids in school.
Yep. Everything is a feedback loop, and kids are people.
Yeah.
Kids are people, and kids are kids. That would be one of my other points too that I thought about throughout this chapter, in terms of thinking about environment. Mm-hmm. I had a chance to go and teach in Tanzania for a little bit too. Very different environment, very different environment. But kids are kids, no matter where you go. Kids are kids. People are people. That's good. We all do the same things. Yeah.
We're all book friends.
We're all book friends.
Yeah.
Products of our environment.
We can all think good, too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, love it. Make it visible if you want it. Make it invisible if you don't.
Those are the big keys from Chapter 7. Next week, book friends, we are going to be starting the second law. Make it attractive, which we just kind of talked about.
Thank you for joining us, book friends. Next week on the BFTTG pod, Jack and Weston, they're thinking good. Some more with you, our book friends. Check out the show notes or the description, comment section for a link to the book and any articles that we talk about in the show. Bye-bye, book friends.
Bye for this time, guys. Do a good thing today.
I love you.
Love you too, dude.